Renee Ellison would remember the sound before she remembered anything else. Not the shouting, not the gasps rippling through the dining room, but the small hollow clatter of her father's cane hitting the marble floor of Magnolia House and rolling somewhere out of his reach. Walter Ellison stood between two much younger men, each gripping an arm hard enough to lift him half off his feet, his sightless eyes wide with the kind of confusion that comes from a world gone suddenly violent for no reason he could name. He was 68 years old. He had taught American history to 3 decades of teenagers. He had been blind for 12 years, and in all that time no one had ever laid a hand on him the way these two men were doing now, dragging him toward the front doors of a restaurant he had eaten in every single Tuesday since his wife passed away. Preston Calloway stood a few feet back with his arms folded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the clatter of dropped silverware and the murmur of 40 stunned diners. He said he did not care that the old man was blind. He said Walter was not paying for his meal, and Walter was leaving, one way or another, tonight. A woman near the window covered her mouth. A busboy froze mid-step with a tray still balanced on his palm. Nobody moved to help. Nobody said a word. The only sound that mattered in that entire room was Walter's breath catching in his throat as his feet left the ground, and somewhere behind the crowd, unnoticed, a phone was already recording every second of it. What Preston Calloway did not know, what he could not have possibly known as he watched 2 grown men haul a blind man across his restaurant floor, was that Renee Ellison had been standing near the coat check since the very first insult was thrown, and her phone had been rolling the entire time. She had come to surprise her father for his birthday. Instead, she found herself frozen in place, watching a stranger's hands close around her father's arms, watching him stumble past tables he had once been guided through gently by hostesses who knew his name. She did not scream. She did not lunge forward. She lifted her phone higher, and she kept recording, because some part of her already understood that this footage was about to become the only thing standing between her father and a lifetime of being disbelieved. By morning, that footage would be the reason Preston Calloway's name trended on every major platform in the country. But that morning was still hours away, and right now, in this restaurant, under these lights, nobody in that room had any idea what they were witnessing. Nobody understood that the quiet, soft-spoken man being thrown out onto the sidewalk was about to become the center of a story that would expose exactly how easily a respected institution could turn on the very people who had trusted it for years. Nobody understood what Renee already carried in her pocket, or what her father carried in the silence he refused to break as they pushed him through the door. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened to Walter Ellison inside Magnolia House that night was only the beginning. The real question was never simply why a blind man had been dragged out of a restaurant over a bill that had already been paid. The real question was who Walter Ellison actually was. Why not a single employee in that building had ever bothered to check the truth before laying hands on him? And what Renee would discover in the days that followed that would turn this ordinary Tuesday dinner into the reason Preston Calloway lost absolutely everything he had spent his career building. What the two of them did not yet know, standing on that cold sidewalk with his cane still missing and his dignity in pieces, was that the truth waiting to surface would change both of their lives forever. The questions Renee needed answered came at her in a rush as she sat beside her father in the back of a stranger's car that night. A kind woman from the restaurant parking lot who had refused to let them wait for a cab in the cold, who had told Preston Calloway that Walter Ellison hadn't paid his bill. Why had nobody bothered to check the register before 2 grown men put their hands on a blind man in front of 40 witnesses? And what exactly had Walter meant, sitting there in silence, with his hands folded in his lap, when he finally said under his breath that Calloway had no idea whose floor he'd just dragged him across? Renee didn't understand that last part yet. She wouldn't understand it for days, but she filed it away, the same way she filed away everything else that night, certain that none of it had happened by accident. To understand what really happened inside Magnolia House, you have to go back further than that Tuesday evening. Back to a life Walter Ellison had built quietly over 3 decades in a modest brick house 2 streets from the high school, where he taught American history to nearly 1,000 students before his eyesight began to fail him. He had married his wife Margaret the summer after he graduated college, and together they raised Renee in that same house, the kind of family that ate dinner at 6 and said grace before every meal. When Margaret died 11 years ago, Walter refused to let grief empty out his life completely. He kept teaching until his vision gave out entirely, and even after retirement he kept one ritual sacred: Every Tuesday evening, rain or shine, he made his way to Magnolia House, the restaurant where he and Margaret had shared their first date 40 years earlier. The staff at Magnolia House had known him for 6 years by the time Preston Calloway was ever hired. The hostesses knew to seat him by the window so the afternoon sun could warm his face, even though he could no longer see it. The old general manager, a woman named Dolores who had since retired, used to walk him personally to his usual table and ask about Renee's shifts at the hospital. Walter paid with the same card every single week, tipped generously, and never once caused a moment of trouble in all those years. Regulars nodded to him by name. He was, in every sense that mattered inside that restaurant, part of the furniture, a fixture as permanent as the chandeliers hanging above the dining room he could no longer see but had memorized by sound and smell. Renee's life moved at a different pace entirely. She worked 12-hour shifts in the emergency room of a hospital 20 minutes from her father's house, the kind of job that left her exhausted most evenings and guilty most mornings for not visiting more often. She called him every day without fail, sometimes twice, checking that he'd eaten, that he'd taken his medication, that the home aide who visited twice a week had shown up on schedule. Walter never once made her feel like a burden for working so much, and she never once let herself believe he was as independent as he insisted he was. That Tuesday, she had switched shifts with a coworker, specifically so she could surprise him for his birthday dinner, carrying a small wrapped gift she never got the chance to give him inside that dining room. Preston Calloway's story ran on an entirely different track. He had been promoted to general manager only 4 months earlier, a fast rise he credited entirely to his own ambition, and one he was determined to prove had been earned. The ownership group above him had recently informed the entire staff that a respected regional food magazine would be sending a reviewer sometime that month, unannounced, and that the restaurant's placement in an upcoming feature on the city's finest dining could mean a level of exposure the business had never seen. Calloway had spent weeks tightening every detail of service, terrified of a single mistake reaching the wrong table on the wrong night. He wanted flawless execution, and in his hunger to deliver it, he had grown suspicious of anything that looked even slightly out of order. 2 weeks before Walter's birthday dinner, Magnolia House hired a new server named Marcus, 22 years old, working his second week on the floor and still learning the rhythm of a dining room that moved faster than anywhere he'd worked before. Marcus had never served a blind customer before Walter, and nobody on staff had thought to walk him through how the process usually worked, how Walter's card was run at the start of the meal rather than the end, so he never had to fumble searching for it in an unfamiliar space. On the night in question, distracted by a rush of new arrivals, Marcus forgot to close out Walter's table properly in the system, leaving it flagged as an open, unpaid check, long after Walter had already settled his bill in full. That flag sat untouched in the system for nearly 20 minutes before Preston Calloway noticed it during his usual sweep of outstanding tables. He saw an elderly man near the door with an unpaid check attached to his name, and rather than walking over calmly to ask a simple question, rather than pulling Marcus aside to check what had actually happened, Calloway let his fear of the reviewer, his fear of any imperfection reaching the wrong ears, override every ounce of judgment he had. He marched across the dining room already certain of what he believed to be true, already certain that the situation called for decisive action rather than a conversation, and he never once considered that the man he was approaching had eaten in that same restaurant nearly 300 times without a single incident. What followed inside that dining room unfolded exactly the way it had already been described, the confrontation growing louder, Calloway's voice rising over Walter's calm insistence that he had already paid. The 2 younger staff members Calloway summoned, closing in on either side of an old man who could not see them coming. Walter reached instinctively for his cane and missed, his fingers finding only air as the 2 men lifted him by the arms instead. Somewhere in that chaos, his voice cracked, for the first time in longer than Renee could remember, not from anger, but from the shock of being handled like something dangerous inside the one place that had always felt safe to him. That was the sound that finally pulled Renee's phone from her pocket, and that was the sound the entire country would soon hear for themselves. By the time Renee got her father settled into his own bed that night, the video she had recorded was already sitting untouched in her phone. 12 minutes of footage she hadn't yet found the strength to watch back. She posted it near midnight, less out of any calculated plan, and more out of a raw need for someone, anyone, to understand what she had just witnessed. She wrote a short caption explaining who her father was, how long he had eaten at that restaurant, and how 2 men had dragged him out over a bill that had already been paid in full. She fell asleep beside her father's couch sometime after 2 in the morning, her phone still in her hand, with no idea that by the time she woke up, The video had already been viewed over 400,000 times. The story spread the way these things spread now, faster than anyone inside Magnolia House could have anticipated. Faster certainly than Preston Calloway could have imagined, as he scrolled through his phone the next morning and saw his own restaurant's name attached to headlines he never expected to read. Local news picked up the footage by noon. By early evening, a national morning show had reached out to Renee directly, asking if she and her father would be willing to speak on camera. Comment sections filled with outrage, with strangers sharing their own memories of loved ones treated poorly because of a disability, with longtime patrons of Magnolia House expressing disbelief that the restaurant they had trusted for years could allow something like this to happen inside its own doors. Rather than address the situation with the kind of humility the moment demanded, ownership issued a brief, defensive statement late that first night, one that emphasized the restaurant's commitment to, quote-unquote, maintaining order and made no direct mention of Walter by name. The statement backfired almost immediately, widely read as an attempt to justify what had happened, rather than apologize for it. Reporters who had been quietly gathering information throughout the day discovered something ownership hadn't accounted for. A local food critic named Harold Weeks had been dining at a corner table that very evening, present specifically to evaluate the restaurant ahead of the magazine feature, and he had witnessed every second of the confrontation with his own eyes. Harold Weeks came forward publicly within 48 hours, confirming to reporters that he had seen the entire incident unfold, exactly as Renee's footage showed it, adding that in his professional opinion, the restaurant's conduct that evening represented one of the most troubling displays of customer treatment he had witnessed in 20 years of reviewing establishments across the region. His account carried a weight that no anonymous internet comment ever could, and it effectively ended any hope Magnolia House had of framing the story as some kind of misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Within days, the very magazine feature Calloway had been so desperate to protect, instead ran an entirely different piece, one detailing the incident in full and questioning how an establishment with such a troubling lapse in judgment had ever been considered for recognition in the first place. As the story gained momentum, an unverified rumor began circulating online, one claiming Walter Ellison had a documented history of leaving restaurants without paying, planted deliberately by an anonymous account that reporters would later trace back to a friend of Preston Calloway's trying to protect his reputation. For a brief and painful stretch, Renee found herself defending her father's character to strangers who had never met him, gathering old receipts, contacting former colleagues from the high school, even reaching out to Dolores, the retired general manager who had known Walter for years and was more than willing to speak on his behalf. The rumor collapsed within a day once real records surfaced, but not before it added an extra layer of exhaustion to a week that had already stretched both of them thin. It was during this period, while reporters and internet detectives alike combed through every detail of the story, that the restaurant's own internal payment records were finally released to a local news outlet through an anonymous source inside the company. The logs confirmed exactly what Walter had said from the very beginning, that his bill had been paid in full at the start of the meal, and that the flag Calloway had acted on was the direct result of Marcus, the new server, failing to properly close the table in the system. It was a mistake born of inexperience and poor training, not deception, and the records proved beyond any argument that Walter Ellison had done absolutely nothing wrong from the moment he sat down that evening. But the deeper revelation, the one that would ultimately reshape the entire story, had nothing to do with the payment records at all. In the days following the incident, a lawyer representing the property holding company that owned the building housing Magnolia House reached out to Renee directly, requesting a private meeting with her and her father. Confused and more than a little wary after the week they'd had, Walter agreed to hear the man out. What he learned in that meeting stunned even Renee, who had spent 35 years believing she understood her father's finances completely. Decades earlier, Margaret's family had quietly placed the building itself into a trust, one that had passed to Walter upon her death, and had simply never come up in conversation, because he had never seen a reason to mention it. Walter Ellison, the blind man dragged across his own dining room floor by two employees acting on Preston Calloway's orders, was, without either the restaurant's ownership group or Calloway himself ever knowing it, the landlord of the very building they operated inside. He had never once used that fact to his advantage in 6 years of quiet Tuesday dinners, never mentioned it to a single hostess or server, content simply to eat in peace at a place that reminded him of Margaret. Corporate leadership, once they learned exactly whose family trust their lease depended on, moved with a speed that bordered on panic, scheduling an emergency meeting and drafting an apology far more sincere than the one issued days earlier, desperate to repair a relationship they had no idea was ever at risk of ending in the first place. When ownership finally sat down across from Walter and Renee, prepared to offer whatever concessions might smooth things over, they expected demands befitting a man who had just discovered enormous leverage he'd never used. Instead, Walter asked for something entirely different. He asked that Marcus, the young server whose honest mistake had started the entire chain of events, keep his job and receive proper training rather than being scapegoated for a manager's poor judgment. He asked that every employee at Magnolia House undergo real training on serving guests with disabilities, something that should have existed long before his own experience made it necessary. And he asked, without a trace of anger in his voice, that Preston Calloway no longer be employed anywhere near a dining room, not out of vengeance, but because a man who reacted to uncertainty with force had no business managing people at all. Preston Calloway was let go within the week, his brief rise to general manager ending exactly as publicly as it had once seemed destined to continue upward. Marcus kept his position, and months later would tell a reporter that Walter's insistence on protecting him was the reason he stayed in the restaurant industry at all, rather than walking away from it entirely. Renee watched her father make these choices with a quiet awe she hadn't expected to feel, understanding for the first time just how deeply Margaret's old lessons about grace under pressure had shaped the man who raised her. Walter never once framed himself as a victim in front of the cameras that came calling in the weeks that followed. He simply asked, each time, to be allowed to return to his usual Tuesday table, undisturbed. Weeks later, once the news cameras had moved on to other stories and the internet had found new outrage to chase, Walter Ellison returned to Magnolia House on an ordinary Tuesday evening, guided gently to the same window seat he had occupied for 6 years, sunlight warming a face that could no longer see it but had never stopped turning toward it out of habit. Renee sat across from him, watching the staff treat her father with a level of care that felt earned rather than performed, aware that none of this would have happened without 12 minutes of footage she almost hadn't had the presence of mind to capture. Somewhere beneath the calm of that evening sat the uncomfortable truth the entire story had exposed. That dignity is so easily stripped from people the moment those in power assume the worst, without bothering to ask a single question first. Would you have believed the crowd that night inside Magnolia House, or would you have believed the quiet blind man insisting he had already paid? And if you had been standing where Renee stood, phone in hand, would you have found the courage to keep recording instead of looking away? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below, because stories like Walter's remind us that the people we overlook most easily are often the ones with the least reason to lie. If this story moved you, stay close, because the next case we're bringing you is one you won't want to miss, and we'll see you there.